Today we're going to dive deep into the Material UI Table Pagination component, and that's really what their pagination component is about. It's not about the nuts and bolts, it's about the component itself. So we can see it down here. We can see I've customized everything from the text on these labels to the color of the different icon buttons here, and I'll also dive deep into the DOM so that you can understand how their table pagination component is composed, because it's composed of subcomponents, material UI subcomponents like toolbar and icon button. So if you want to learn more about this, stick around. Alright, so at the beginning of this video I showed you my customized table, but I've stripped out all the props except for the most basic and necessary props, and one by one we'll add them back in. But for now, what I can show you is how the pagination component is rendered in the DOM. So we see over here in the DOM, usually the pagination component is placed inside a table row in the footer at the bottom of the table, and so really the top level of the pagination component is this toolbar here. And so we can see that there's a toolbar, there's MUI pagination dash spacer, the select component, or really that's its label there, a select, an input, which in this case is a select component. That's actually an MUI component, although you can set this to use the native HTML select component. And then most interestingly, there's some icon buttons at the end. So that's the basic composition. So like I said, these are actually MUI components themselves. So the MUI team seems to like to do this, where they take a component and just compose it of existing more granular MUI components. So what this means is that there's opportunity for us to be able to target, usually through the props, but also through the styling, like the new SX prop in MUI 5, or if you're still using MUI 4 through the Make Styles API, there's opportunity to target these different classes that we see here, like MUI button base dash root, or any of these here, the MUI dash toolbar dash root. We can target these and add whatever kind of color or styling we would like to through CSS. However, the props are quite they really give opportunity to specifically target most of these, which is somewhat unusual, to be able to target pretty much any subcomponent within an MUI component simply through the props. They kind of expect you usually to do it through the SX prop. So with that said, what we've got here is just a basic setup for, I've got TypeScript enabled, I've got the nuts and bolts of how the actual pagination works already coded, because really what I'm focusing on in this demo is the actual styling of the table pagination component. That's literally its name, is table pagination. So most of the nuts and bolts I have in here are straight from the MUI pagination example in their docs. They did a great job there. However, one thing that I did change, other than first I added TypeScript, I actually put in a remote fetch. This endpoint unfortunately doesn't work very often, so I've also nabbed their data and I just have it locally, and I'll include links to all of this code in the video details, so take a look there if you want to see that. But anyway, they've got pretty straightforward, I'll just go over it at a high level, they've got a pretty straightforward way to piece or partition the data, if you want to call it that, to be able to render only the data that we care about. And they've got a quick algorithm here that does that. So let's go over a couple of the props that I had to leave in on the pagination in order to, they're required props, so in order to have it working. And those feed into the nuts and bolts of pagination. So they're not that exciting, but they are necessary. So we've got the count here, and rows per page options. So let's start here. This is the select that we're looking at. So you can populate it with whatever values you want, depending on how many rows you want to display. We've got rows per page, so depends on what's selected here. We've got the count, which is our total data, the length of it, and we've got our page number that we're currently on, and then we've got a couple of of event emitters here, and we've got the handlers on them. So just at a high level, and I do have TypeScript enabled once again, handle change page just sets the page so that our algorithm can select the proper, in my case, 5 rows. That's what I have selected by default. So next up, handle change rows per page. Once again, it's just setting state, and maybe they say, hey, let's set it to 5, let's set it to 10. Whatever they've selected, that updates our state, and the algorithm has the proper state values to use. So we've got the state right here. We've got the page that we're currently on, the rows per page, and then the data, which I'm just loading either remotely or through an array that I've got simply for ease of use here. So anyway, that's at a high level. Quick look at our object that we're looking at. I'm actually only using the first. I'm using these 3 and then the length. That's the only data that I'm actually displaying in the table. So, but I think it's good practice to have TypeScript enabled. So with that said, let's actually go down to the meat of this video, which is looking at our table pagination. So by my count, there were 18 props listed in the docs for table pagination, which is a lot compared to the average component. Usually they're more like 6 or 8 or something like that. Now there's always some props that are available that aren't listed, like Araya labels or really just any potential default prop for a React component. So keep that in mind. There's actually more than 18 possible, but we don't need all of them right now. So anyway, I will just start going down the list of props, and I'm going to put the values back in that will create that table that we saw at the beginning of this video. So the first one I'm going to do, let me get my bearings here. Let's go ahead and do the label rows per page. So this takes a, I believe the typing of it in the docs, in the MUI docs, is element type. What that means is it just wants a component or an element. So I'm going to happily feed it in just a span here. And we'll see what that does. So now instead of the default text, which was rows per page, we fed it this, really it's about the text, the label that you're feeding it, but we fed it a span. I believe it was a div by default in the rendering, but we fed it a span here. And it's interesting to note, even though it says in the docs that it requires an element type, I've actually found, at least with TypeScript not enabled, that it will accept a string value. So yeah, even with TypeScript, it's happy enough to accept that. So sometimes their docs have maybe less than all possible values listed. So never hurts to try something with Material UI and just see how far you can push their library. So in the same vein, let's update the other prop that enables us to change a label. So that's label displayed rows. This one's a little more complex, really. So it actually lets you take, I believe it's 3 of the values, and I believe it's count and page, and probably the other one is rows per page. But anyway, I'm just going to create a function. So it actually requires a function to be passed into it, and it's going to do whatever you tell it to do with that function. In this case, I'm going to have it pass me the current page, and then I am simply going to return some text that has that page displayed. And I want to do string interpolation here, not just a simple string. So let's try that. So if you caught it real quick there, it changed from our default text to page 0, and look, it dynamically updates with that page that we're on. So that's pretty cool. Like I said, in the docs, the typing for this looks a little bit intimidating. And even if you're not using TypeScript, you still need to understand what the type is so that you know how to use this function. But anyway, pretty dynamic label there because we're able to use 3 of the different state values. So the next one we're going to look at is, let's look at the icon button props. So I mentioned that there are 2 icon buttons by default. The back and the next button, of course. Can't do much with pagination if you don't have those. So those being Material UI components, then the Table Pagination component has exposed through its API a way to pass props directly to the back icon and the forward icon. So I'm going to take advantage of that, and let's say secondary. And really you can use any of the theme values like primary, secondary, I forget what all they are, maybe like warning, error, alert. Those values like that should just be present in your theme. So, well, my back button is currently not enabled, but let's see if we go to the next page. Yeah, we've got our secondary color there. You can see how that one's kind of a purple color and that one's a black color. So let's do the same thing, keep it consistent, do the same thing for our next button. So there we go. We've got that in place. So now they're both that secondary color. So interesting thing, I actually, I was looking at the icon button props that are available. And there's, for example, a sizing prop, and it accepts values of small, medium, large, and I think extra large or extra small or something like that. And I tried passing those values, and it did not actually accept those. It didn't throw any errors, but it just didn't change the rendering. And so what that tells me is perhaps they have disabled or somehow limited what props these buttons will accept when they are within this pagination component. So just kind of interesting getting a little glimpse into the nuts and bolts there behind the scenes. The next one I'll add is the select props. So we have this select here. By default, it's a Material UI component. In the example in the docs, they actually disable that. I think they set it to native. Let's give that a try. Yeah, so you can see the difference there. I'll take that off. And what I'll do is I'll just add input props. And I will say Araya label page number. So I am not an expert by any means on Araya compliance, that's accessibility compliance, but I'm getting a little bit more into it recently. So anyway, we've got that Araya label on there, and I did not look into what all props you can pass to the input props, but this is a select component, and a select component itself is composed of MUI subcomponents. So what we're doing is ultimately passing in props directly to the composing component of the select component here, the composing input component. So getting pretty deep into things there, and MUI is a pretty impressive library, and so there's a lot to learn about it. So next up we'll do show first button, and that's simply a Boolean. Interestingly, by default it is set to false, but I've enabled that there. Seems to me like maybe by default it should have been set to true, but whatever. We can quickly fix that if that's something we want to do. So now we've got both of them. And even though we don't have a prop that exposes a way to style these, so like right now our back and next buttons are not in sync style-wise with our last and our first buttons, we could target these through nested selectors, and I'll give a demonstration briefly about targeting those. I may not target that specific component, but I'll show you the gist of it. I'll use a nested selector so you can see how you could really target anything that you wanted to. So those are all that I'm going to. I'll enable the SX prop here in a minute, but there's 2 more props that I want to mention first. First is the actions component, and this lets you pass in, it's kind of like the label rows per page. You can pass in an element type. So if you wanted, you could construct, I'll go ahead and comment that out. You could construct your very own, this action area. You could construct your own component in here. I think it's where these action buttons are, is all that you'd be modifying. These labels are still as we've set them, but if I set actions component, then it would modify where the action buttons are. So interesting to note, if you do that, then these icon button props won't work anymore, because you're replacing the default rendered components or elements with your own, and so of course these props won't work. And I believe those are the only two that essentially get disabled if you choose to create your own custom actions component. So just keep that in mind. In a similar line here, then we've got the component prop, and this is common to most, if not all, material UI components that you can, or at least all the ones that are composed, that are complex and have subcomponents within them. You can actually change the root component or the root element. So I think I still have the box. I've imported box, so I could go down and oops, there's my big array of data. Normally it's best, taking a side note here, normally it's best to have your array not in the same file, but for ease of the code sandbox, which I've created, and you'll be able to see live if you'd like to go check it out from the links in the show details. I've just left the array in there, but that's not good practice, so don't do what I do in that case. Anyway, so I could put in a box component, and I'm not sure if that's exactly the syntax it'll like. In fact, I think you want to do it just like this. Let's see if TypeScript likes it. There we go. So what that does is, well, you can tell pretty significantly it changed the rendering down here. Let's see if I can get past our action component. So we've still got our toolbar. Let's see, we've got our row here, pagination root. Somewhere in here, it's we should see the box component. Of course, since I'm doing a recorded thing here, then I won't be able to find it, but I did see it the other day when I was playing with that. Well, anyway, somewhere in here is a box component. I'm just not seeing it. The way that you'd be able to tell is it would say MUI box-root. So anyway, we can see the effect of it even if I'm unable to find it in the DOM, spur of the moment. But so that's an important thing to understand, and also important to understand that these videos never go perfectly. Part of the fun of it, I guess. So anyway, I'm going to disable that. I'll just leave it commented out, and here we are back to how we should be. Just taking the default root. So you may be wondering, why would you ever want to change that? Well, I just threw in a box, but maybe you have some custom component that you've created that you really want to use for rendering. So with that said, let's go and find our, let's go and add in styling for the SX prop. So the SX prop takes an object, and I don't know that I've done this with TypeScript yet, so we'll see how it likes things. In fact, the SX prop may be a little bit difficult to use with TypeScript, so I may just, if we have any trouble, for now I may just disable TypeScript and just be able to see an example of it. I think sometimes the theme is difficult to get working with TypeScript, anything that relies on theme. So anyway, we'll see how this goes. So I'm going to put in background color, which VS Code was just a little less helpful here. Let me bump this down to the next line, make it a little bit easier to work with. Let's say RGBA. All right, we're back here. I've disabled TypeScript just for a moment and updated the SX prop. I added MUI Table Pagination toolbar and MUI Table Pagination select label, and also MUI Table Pagination input. So I'm targeting those. We can see the effect here. We've got that gray background now, and I've added a bold font weight and color here to both of these. So you can see how straightforward it is to use the SX prop to target nested selectors. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and figure out the typing for this, and I'll add that in the video details. Feel a little bad that I don't have it off the top of my head, but really these theme things are difficult with TypeScript. So I'll get it working though and give that update. So I hope that this video was helpful, and I appreciate your time. Hope you learned something.